from the days of the Vietnam War back in the 1960s when there was a massive movement because there was a draft, and a draft means that every young man of military age had to go and fight in the war. And so there was a massive movement because so many of our families were affected by the war. That came to the attention, obviously, of the people in power, and they ended the draft. And these days, the military is, quote, a volunteer army. And I say volunteer in quotes because it really is one of the few opportunities that people in poorer communities have to be able to get a free college education, to be able to get a job, especially in rural areas when there are so few opportunities. So some people call it more of a poverty draft. And so these days, there are not a lot of families that are directly affected by the military, which means it's harder to get people more actively involved. The other issue is that the wars these days are more hidden. It's not like in the days of Vietnam where there was one war that we were all against. When the administration of President Bush launched a war in Iraq, there was a massive outcry, not only in the United States, but around the world. It was considered that demonstration that took place February of 2003, the largest demonstrations in the history of the world, and it was all against a U.S. invasion of Iraq. But after that, the anti-war movement died down. And one of the reasons is because the wars dragged on, and it especially died down after President Bush was replaced by President Obama, because people thought he was an anti-war president. He had gained the lead over his opponent, Hillary Clinton, because he had opposed the war in Iraq. People were also very excited by the historic win of the first black president we ever had, and he seemed like such a nice guy. And also, it turned out many of the people opposing the war under the Bush administration were Democrats, and they didn't want to protest wars that were continued by a Democratic president. On top of that, I would say there was a financial crisis that affected a lot of people, and they turned inward looking at how they were going to keep their homes, find jobs, and those kinds of day-to-day issues. So for all of those reasons, the anti-war movement really fell apart when Barack Obama became president. So I would say there's a combination now of many wars, not just the Iraq War, but there's 7 conflicts that the U.S. is involved in. The fact that these wars are hidden because there is not a draft, and so not many of the families are directly involved, and because the anti-war movement fell apart during the Obama years. Those are some of the reasons. But despite all of that, I would say that we still have an impact. We have an impact when we come out in large numbers because it makes the people in power reluctant to engage in new wars. It has an impact, for example, on the way that wars are conducted because the people in power try harder not to have as many civilian casualties, for example. And there are times when we've actually prevented new wars. And that was the case around Iran when there was a major outcry against the U.S. going to war with Iran and a major push for a nuclear deal with Iran that came into effect in 2015. So that is a good example of how anti-war activism can actually prevent a war from happening. Unfortunately, when Donald Trump became president, a lot of the gains that we have made have been falling apart, and he is ramping up the wars that were already in place, like the one in Afghanistan, as well as threatening new wars like with Iran and North Korea. He's giving more money to the already bloated military, and he's giving the military an open green light to use more brutal tactics. And that's why we've seen an increase in the number of civilian casualties in places like Iraq and Syria. It only means that we have to ramp up the anti-war movement, both in the United States and globally. There's not one answer to say, but what's the best way to do activism? There are some places in Germany, for example, that are near bases, like the Stuttgart base, that is so important to this whole drone program. And people have been protesting there the complicity of the German government in this program. There are people who are standing up to NATO, and especially the push by the Trump administration to get countries to put more of their own money into their militaries so that NATO would be even more powerful than it is now. I think resisting the expansion of NATO is a very important thing to do. And here in the United States, there are people who feel the best tactic is to elect progressive people to government so that they can be our voices inside of government. And certainly that's important to do. There's other people who feel like work on the outside is the most important, and that is organizing for demonstrations, rallies, blockades, sit-ins, die-ins. There's a new tactic that we are starting at CODEPINK that's called Divest from the War Machine, where we are doing all the research into how our communities, our elected officials, our universities, our cities, our faith-based institutions are connected to the war machine, and how we can sever those links. So we're asking our politicians to sign a pledge that they will not take money from the weapons industry. We're asking our cities to say that it will look into where city money is invested, and if they are indeed invested in any of these companies, they will take their money out. We're asking universities to look at the same connections. We're asking engineering students to sign a pledge saying, I won't use my skills to further the killing machine. So we're very excited because this has a lot of ways that people on an individual basis or within their local communities or on the national level can say, I will make sure that I am not part of this war machine. I think that in building an anti-war movement or looking back at 2003, we have to be more radical. It's one thing to come together in large numbers and walk around the city and then everybody go home. That's not enough. If everybody had walked around the city, but even if 5% of those people stayed and went into the halls of power and sat down and refused to leave, went in with blood all over us like the bloody victims and refused to leave. If we went into the offices of the weapons makers and we refused to leave. If we go to the people who are the most rah-rah cheerleaders for war and we embarrass them in their communities, we go to their homes, we go to the places that they worship. We put out pictures of them saying that they are criminals.
102 people on hunger strike. These desperate people. I'm about to address it, man, but you got to let me speak. I'm about to address it. Commander-in-Chief. Let me address it. Close Guantanamo today. Why don't you let me address it, man? Release those 86 prisoners. Why don't you sit down and I will tell you exactly what I'm going to do. Today, that includes 57 million. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. Ma'am. Thank you. You should let me finish my sentence.
I think there are many ways to be more radical, more determined, more putting ourselves at risk. I have been to jail many, many, many times, been arrested many times, and I keep saying to young people, come join us, please. And some of them will, but most of them are afraid. They're afraid, will it jeopardize their student loans? Will it jeopardize their ability to get a job in the future? And I said, look, be afraid of your country going to being involved in a nuclear war or the end of the earth as we know it because of the climate crisis. Those are the things that you should fear, not your security clearance to get a certain job. So I think that young people have to let go of those individual concerns about their career opportunities and really think in the much bigger terms about how these issues of war are affecting the planet, the poor victims. I think every day now about the people in Yemen and the children particularly who are dying from the war and the effects of the starvation caused by war. And that gives me not only a lot of anger, but a lot of courage to do more radical things. So I would say put our bodies at risk more, and we will have a more effective movement. CODEPINK is a women-led group, but it encourages men and everyone to be involved. We started it after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan to try to stop the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Obviously, we were not successful, but we keep fighting to stop the wars that we're in, prevent new ones, and roll back the militarism that is affecting our country and affecting the planet. We feel that it's critical to build a much stronger global alliance. When I was focusing my work on drone warfare, for example, we built up a network in Europe to try to stop the European countries from purchasing armed drones themselves. And our connections in Germany have been very strong and very successful on that. I think the connections around NATO are very important to build up and show that NATO is not a force for peace, but it's an aggressive force. I think that it's important that we pick maybe international days of protest. There are international peace days. We should be doing work together on those days. And again, not just standing on a street corner with some signs, but doing something a little more radical. And I think that we should be learning from each other. We should be inviting each other to our actions. We should do campouts at some of the bases where we are building skills. For example, I always thought it would be wonderful if during the warmer summer months, we had encampments right near some of these bases that we used as training centers, kind of like the Occupy movement that we had and other countries had, where you could do daily protests, but you would also be learning together, forming community, building resistance. So those are some of the kinds of things that I think we have to do to build a global sense of solidarity. When we do all of this work in saying what it is we don't want, it's really important to say what it is we do want, especially if we want to get young people involved in this movement. They have to see it as something that's positive, that's going to lead to something that makes their lives better. And so we encourage people and CODEPINK to be part of what we call building a local peace economy, to be involved in things in your community that are building the kind of changes you want to see. That could be anything from having a community organic garden to building the bike-friendly cities, to having cities that cut off cars and have pedestrian walkways, to organizing and living in community. I'm part of a farm community in an urban area, where we are constantly having group meetings about what we can do not only to make the farm a more inviting place for people in the community, but how can we go out into the community and be working with people on their issues. I think it's also important to recognize that even if you're fighting on one particular front, like for trying to stop war, you're also trying to build the alternatives like living wages for people, like good healthcare system for everybody, like free college education. These are all things that make a community healthy. I think it's also important to focus on cultural issues. It's cultural issues that bring us together. And instead of just consuming culture that corporations give us, we have to make our own culture. We have to write our own songs, sing our own songs, have gatherings where we come together to share poetry that we write, to have an art day that we're all painting together, to really bring out the talents that all of us have. I think what's called the alternative media is something that all of us have to become, where we are citizen journalists. We are constantly taking videos of what we find out there, both good and bad, and posting it and creating an online community as well. So I think there's so much that we can do to show the kind of world we want to live in. But I would say the most important aspect of all of it is to build your own community, because you can't keep hitting yourself against the wall fighting these big corporations unless you have a base. And oftentimes that base might not be the family you're born into. I know in my family we have a lot of Trump supporters and a lot of difficult family conversations. It's important to create the community of people who believe in the same kind of world that we want to see, a world where there is no child who is dying from hunger, a world where there is no war, a world where we celebrate our diversity instead of hating each other for being different. And so as we build that beloved community, it gives us strength to not only be fighting against the things that we don't like in this capitalist dog-eat-dog world, but to build the kind of socialist, sharing, loving, compassionate society that we want to live in.